In a study of over 11,000 college students asked about their research habits and practices, 84% of them mentioned that getting started was one of the most difficult things about research. And when asked about specific adjectives that they would use to describe the research process, many of them mentioned things like fear, dread, stressed, confused, and overwhelmed. So in this video, we're going to talk about that process of getting started, especially in relationship to finding sources. And hopefully this will help you reduce your fear and anxiety in relationship to the research process. So we're going to talk specifically about three things in this video. We're going to talk about the difference between search engines and databases. We're going to talk about which databases in our library, the BSU library, that you should use. And we're going to talk about keywords and how you can think about keywords to find the sources that will work best for you in your research project. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between search engines and databases. You're all probably very familiar with Google as a search engine. And the thing about search engines is when I type my search terms into the search bar, the search engine searches through everything that exists on the internet. So for purposes of this video, I'm going to imagine that I'm interested in the topic of gender in sports. In particular, I'm going to imagine that I'm a big Olympics fan and spent a lot of time this summer watching the Olympics. And one thing I was intrigued about or may have noticed, was the way in which coverage of events seem to differ based on the gender of the athletes. So the way sports were talked about or the way coverage happened. And I'm wondering if other researchers have noticed similar kinds of things, or if other people have, analyzed this in the past. So if I start with a search engine and I look for results on gender in sports, you notice I get over 100 million results. What that means is, as the researcher, I have to look through all of those. The tool itself, the search engine itself, is doing no filtering work for me. Instead, as the researcher, all of the filtering falls on my shoulders. And that is the key difference between a search engine and a database. Databases, instead, do not search the entirety of information, say, on the internet, but rather have already made a much smaller collection of sources and are only searching through that smaller collection of sources. So our library itself owns a number of these databases, which are very, very useful to researchers. So if I go here to databases A to Z on the library website, it will take me to a list of the databases that the library owns, alphabetical. Some of you may already be familiar with databases such as Academic OneFile or Academic Search Premier. These are very general academic databases. And unlike the internet, which searches everything, unlike Google as a search engine, which will look through everything that's on the internet, Academic OneFile only looks through articles from 8,000 academic journals, as well as podcasts, transcripts from NPR, CNN, and CBC, and full-text New York Times articles. So even though this is a fairly large collection of sources, it's much, much smaller than a search engine. And so a lot of that filtering work has already been done for me as a researcher. And yet 8,000 academic journals is still quite large as a place for me to begin my research. In fact, one of the things I really want you to understand is that in searching for sources, it's best to begin as narrow as you possibly can. So rather than beginning with this kind of general database, I'm going to encourage you to begin with a very specific communication database. I can find that by going to subjects and looking at communication studies, which will bring me to 29 databases that are more specific to the kind of sources I would want to find as a communication researcher. And you notice here that a best bet button exists on communication and mass media Collection and Communication and Mass Media Complete. And I'm going to tell you that Communication and Mass Media Complete is the database that I recommend the most, and among my colleagues in the communication department, it's the one that they would recommend the most. And Communication and Mass Media Complete, as in a difference to Academic OneFile, doesn't look through 8,000 journals, but rather 300 journals and 100 more with priority coverage. And these are going to be journals specific to the area of communication research. So think about the difference between looking through that collection of material versus Google. A lot of work has already been done to make sure that the results that I get using this database are going to be much more likely to be useful and relevant to me than using Google. So now that we've talked about databases and search engines, and we've talked a little bit about the specific databases that you should use as a researcher in communication studies, I want to talk to you a little bit about keywords. This is the other central idea in finding good sources for your research paper. So if we go back to the project that I'm interested in, gender and sports, you'll notice that I've used all capitals here. What this does is to signify these two terms as a Boolean phrase. What this means is that it tells the database to search for sources that have gender as well as sports in them. I don't want to find resources that only talk about gender. I don't want to find resources that only talk about sports. I want those resources that specifically talk about gender and sports. When I do this, you'll notice that I have 303 results come in. Now this is way, way different than the over 100 million that come up for me in Google. It makes it much more manageable. And yet 300 is still a lot of sources to look through to find relevant research for my paper. And so I need to find other ways to limit these results. One way is to go over here on the left-hand side of the screen, and I can refine my results in several ways. Here I can limit my results to only those that have full text access, as well as only those that are from scholarly peer-reviewed journals. So in this class, you'll be expected to use academic scholarly articles, and so limiting through this will be really useful to you. And this is true of a lot of the research that you'll have to do in academic classes. When I click on this limitation, you notice close to 100, almost 100. It narrows my results to almost 100, which is very useful to me. You can also limit by full text. This is a really good thing to do if you're working on a very short time frame. If you are trying to write a paper within a week or a couple of days, and you don't have time to find texts that our library currently does not have full access to, that can be a really good button. But I would discourage you from using it if you have gotten started early on your search process. So for instance, in this class, your final paper won't be due for months. And so I would encourage you to access those sources that you still might not be able to get full text to immediately, because there will be other ways to access that text through our library, which we'll talk about in a later video. I can also limit my search based on the publication date. Most of the time in research, you want to have articles that are fairly current, although this depends a bit on the actual topic that you are choosing to look at. In this case, I think it's okay to have a sort of a larger time frame. I might find some resources that are 10 years old and yet still seem fairly useful for the kind of analysis that I'm doing. One other thing I want to draw your attention to here is subject. So if I click on this, it will show me the way that this database is organizing these search results based on larger subject categories. So at this point, I'm not going to click one of these, but I might end up finding that, while I was sort of interested in thinking about gender differences more generally, maybe as my research process goes on, I think really I'd be most interested in looking at masculinity more specifically and sort of how that is discussed in sports coverage. This would allow me to then limit my sources even further based primarily on that category. This also gives me some ideas of different kinds of terms that I might end up using in my search box to yield different sorts of results. So if I go back up here, I've moved from 303 search results to 192. That's much more manageable number, and yet it's still awfully large. So I might want to refine this search even further. One way I can do that is simply to add another term. So it's not really sports and gender that I'm interested in a broad way. Really what I'm actually after is sports media. So adding media to this can help me refine my search. You notice I go from 192 down to 53 results. Much easier to work through. And yet I might still want to get more narrow than that. One way I can do that is I can add quotations around sports media. This means that we'll look specifically for the phrase sports media in the results. That brings me down to 21 results. That's a very useful number. I can read through quite quickly 21 titles and even peruse abstracts if I need to find, am I getting the sources that I want to get? Will it give me good information? Or do I need to mess around with these terms here to find different kinds of resources? So if I scroll down and I just sort of read the titles, I can get a pretty good sense of what kinds of articles are coming up. This first one is going to talk about sports coverage generally, probably not quite what I'm interested in. This next title definitely isn't what I had in mind, so it's not going to work for me. This third title seems like it might kind of be about what I want to, what I'm interested in studying, but I don't know for sure. So what I'm going to do is just hover over this, and this brings me to a box that will give me a little abstract on the article, and I can get a much better sense of what this article's about. And when I read the abstract, I realize, yeah, that this is actually exactly what I'm interested in. It's going to talk about differences in dialogue based on the gender of the athlete in sports coverage. Perfect. So one thing that I might want to do once I find a few sources that really look like they will focus on what I'm interested in, I want to look at a few different things. One, I want to look at here again, the subjects that are listed. This will give me other ideas for terms that I can plug in here to find better results. One thing I notice in this one is sports journalism. So while I've written sports media, sports journalism might be a better term to get me closer to the results that I want. The other thing, another way to find keywords that might help me find the sources I want to find, is to go to the article itself. And on many articles, not all, but on many, they will list right under the abstract a number of keywords that the author has supplied that tell the librarians how to organize this particular article in the databases. So I notice a few things here. One is Olympics as a very specific term. So instead of just sports media, I might want to put Olympics. It also draws my attention to not just gender, but issues of identity. So it gives me a set of other keywords that might help me yield better results. So in this video, we've talked a little bit about the difference between search engines and databases, what databases will be useful to you as a communication studies researcher, and how to think about keywords as a way of finding the sources that will work best for you. In future videos, we're going to talk a little bit about how we might expand our searches, how we might use folders to help us find useful lists of sources, as well as other kinds of library tools such as interlibrary loan.